Good evening. Welcome to the opening session of How Lakes Work. I'm John Miller, president of Muskoka Steamships and Discovery Center in Gravenhurst, and it's my pleasure to join you tonight as we explore one of Muskoka's greatest treasures, our lakes. This three-part webinar series, presented in partnership with the Friends of Muskoka Watershed, brings together outstanding scientists and stewards of the environment to help us understand how our lakes function and how climate change is reshaping them. Together, we'll learn not only about the physics and biology beneath the surface, but also about the cultural and ecological significance these waters hold for all who live, work, and play in Muskoka. Throughout this webinar, we encourage you, our audience, to post questions in our chat, in our Q&A, and we'll read them to our presenters at 8:30 p.m. tonight, which is when the presentations end. If your question's already been posted, then click like, and it will move up in priority. We can't answer all the questions that we have in our time allowed, so if we don't get to yours, please email us at the address that we post in the chat, and we'll work on getting those answers to you. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll post it on our website, realmuskoka.com, in a couple of days. Thank you for being here and for your ongoing commitment to protecting the lakes that define our region and sustain our way of life. I'm delighted to introduce Wendy Fairbairn, our General Manager of the Muskoka Discovery Center, for our land acknowledgement. Enjoy the webinar, and over to you, Wendy.
Good evening. We would like to take the time to acknowledge the First Peoples who, for thousands of years before us, were and are still the keepers and caregivers of this land where we are now, live and work. We are dedicated to honoring the Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And in particular for the Muskoka, all four cultures, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Métis, that inhabited these lands either currently or historically. We recognize all generations of Indigenous people and their historic connection to this place, and we are grateful for the opportunity to gather here at this time. I would like to now welcome to the webinar Norman Yan, who will be introducing tonight's speakers.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Wendy. My name is Norman Yan. I'm a director of Friends of the Muskoka Watershed and a friend of the Muskoka Discovery Center. You'll hear from me in a webinar next week, but my role tonight is to introduce our first two webinar speakers. Dr. Sapna Sharma from York University will get us started. Her work highlights how lakes worldwide respond to climate change, including rapid ice loss, warming waters, degrading water quality, and changing fish distributions. Dr. Sharma was the inaugural director of the United Nations Global Water Academy, and her research is so well regarded that she has been inducted into the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars and has been acknowledged as one of Canada's top water scientists. Not a bad way to start our webinars. After Dr. Sharma's focus on winter, we'll move to the ice-free season that we all love for the next several webinars, starting with Dr. Neil Hutchinson's presentation, The Things We Can't See, Lake Physics. Dr. Hutchinson is an old friend, friend of the Muskoka Watershed's board. He has a PhD in toxicology, and he recently retired from 20 years of consulting on issues facing lakes all across the country. He first came to Muskoka in 1984 to work on acid rain and conducted research that was recognized for its excellence around the world. Happily, when he retired, he stayed here. So this week we'll start with lake physics in the winter and then in the summer, and next week we'll move to why it all matters. I'll now pass the microphone and the video to Dr. Sharma for her talk labeled On Thin Ice, Our Lakes Feeling the Heat.
Thanks so much, Norm. And thank you for the invitation. to come speak with you here today. And thank you to the organizers of this webinar series. I'm really excited to see all of the different episodes and learn from our esteemed panelists. So thanks for having me. And I also wanted to say a quick welcome. I saw in the panelists in the attendees list there are people our trainees or attendees for participants from the Unitar Global Water Academy. So welcome to a different webinar series, and also to our community scientists from the Community Lake Ice Collaboration. So I saw some of you here as well. So I'm really excited that you're joining us on a cold Tuesday night, and look forward to talking to you a little bit about winter. And before I begin, I just wanted to say thank you to the people without whom none of this research would be possible. And the first is John Magnuson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was my mentor as a postdoc, and he actually introduced me to lake ice. So I used to work on climate change and water temperatures and fisheries. And he would walk by my desk when I was a postdoc, and every few months come by with another long-term ice record and be like, "Hey, do you want to study, this ice record?" And it started with Lake Mendota, and then it's grown, as you'll see, to thousands of lakes around the world. So he really got me started into lake ice and has continued to be a great collaborator. I'd also like to thank my students at York University, who've just been a delight to work with over the last almost 15 years, as well as collaborators from around the world. As you're going to see, a lot of this research is quite global in scale, so having an amazing set of global collaborators really helps to connect the global with the local. And of course, funding agencies without whom the research wouldn't be possible. And as Norm mentioned, I researched the impacts of climate change on lakes worldwide, but my favorite topic to study is ice. And there are several reasons for that. And first is the importance of ice to communities. Northern communities have relied on ice for centuries around the world. We have examples of ice harvesting done to keep food cold for refrigeration from local lakes and rivers. If you're in the Ontario region, Lake Simcoe was a popular area for harvesting ice. Lake festivals are a really important component of the social fabric for communities around the world. The largest ice festival is actually in China, where approximately 25 million people attend each year. Ice recreation is a huge component of the use of ice, for example, hockey, ice fishing. I was born and raised in Brantford, Ontario, the home of Wayne Gretzky. So ice hockey has been kind of integral in my life, and I think many others across Canada, as well as ice roads. So for many remote communities, they rely on ice roads in the winter over lakes and rivers and across the landscape to access food, fuel, supplies, and even social networks. So ice is really an important part of communities around the Northern Hemisphere. And because ice has been so important to so many communities around the world, ice data have been collected long before the advent of meteorological stations. The oldest ice record that we have collected by humans goes back to 875 AD. And that was from a lake in Germany on the Swiss-German border, Lake Constance. And at some point, they actually used to cross with the bust of John the Evangelist, who you can see here, from a church in Germany to a church in Switzerland across the frozen lake as a sign of friendship between the two countries. But this lake didn't actually freeze regularly. So although the record goes back quite far, the last record was 1963 when the lake froze. A more consistent long-term record actually comes from Japan, and I'm going to talk about this one a little more, from Shinto priests who've been recording the dates that the Lake Sua freezes for millennia and have written it down since 1397. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those ice records. And then community scientists actually are some of the most amazing sources of ice records. And I wanted to highlight, for example, the Community Lake Ice Collaboration, which is a collection. It involves hundreds of people across the United States who've been recording the dates that their lakes froze and thawed since 1989. And we send letters to each other. So Dr. Ken Stewart from SUNY Buffalo started this in the 1980s, and he used to send postcards to each. At that time, there were 600 participants monitoring over 1,000 lakes. And now we send letters and emails and just to connect with one another and hear about how our lakes are freezing. And actually, some of the best records come from ice gambling pools from around the world, where many people are observing a lake or river freezing. So the certainty is quite high of our records, even if the data go back centuries. And because lake ice data have been collected for so long and from around the world, lake ice has actually been studied for decades as well. So I did this project with my collaborator, John Magnuson, as well as Kirill Shapov, who was a Siberian researcher who came to do a postdoc in Toronto at York University and read and understood German and Russian, as well as another postdoc, Josh Culpepper, who could read a little bit of German. And then we worked with collaborators who could read Japanese as well. And what we did was, what we were interested in is how far does the ice literature go back? So if we're thinking about in the English language, the earliest papers we've been able to find, except for a couple that were from a different country but published in English, was the 1960s. And when we opened up our dictionaries, opened up our world, we saw that actually lake ice has been studied for over 150 years and published on. And Russians were amongst the first to really understand the impacts of weather and climate on ice. In 1886, 1886, there were these amazing maps of 20,000 ice records from across the Russian Empire. And they made these maps of where and when ice formed and thawed across the Russian Empire. A lot of the Russian literature actually came from Polish scientists who had actually been exiled to Siberia. And so during their time in exile, were recording the environment around them. Even back in the 1800s, they were thinking about oscillations in the data sets and even climate variation in the 1920s with the Japanese were studying sunspot cycles and the different cycles in ice records that we can observe because of these large-scale climate drivers. And so then, it moved on to thinking more about the models and thinking about drivers of ice phenology, and ice phenology is the timing of ice on and ice off. But I really liked this study because it really gave you a perspective of all of the work that's been done in the field, and not only in the English language. And so I'm going to tell you about my favorite ice record. I mentioned it briefly, and it's Lake Suwa. And Lake Suwa is located in Japan in the Japanese Alps region. And there's a Shinto shrine on the shores of Lake Suwa. And so that's why um, the Shinto monks and Shinto priests have been recording the dates of the date that the lake freezes every year for millennia, and writing it down since the 14th century. And the reason is because it's really important to their tradition. So a Shinto legend states that there was a god and goddess that lived together on the shores of Lake Suwa. And sometimes what happens when people live together for too long, they got into a disagreement and the goddess moved out. And she built herself a shrine on the other side of the lake. And every winter, the god would cross the frozen Lake Suwa with his dragon, and he would cross the lake to seek forgiveness and amendments from the goddess. And so here I had the pleasure of working with the Japanese priests and historians and linguists to understand what the god left behind. And so these are his footsteps. These are the footsteps that he leaves behind when he crosses the lake. And every winter, when the ice forms, and it's called the Amawatari. It's this ridge that forms on the lake. The Shinto priests perform a purification ceremony, a purification of body, of mind, of home. They gather important business leaders from the community and they celebrate the event. And in the past, they would use the size and the direction of the ridge to actually forecast rice harvest in the region. And they continue, 15 generations of the same family has continued to do this to today. And my collaborator, John Magnuson, went to Lake Suwa. He met with the chief priest, Mr. Miyasaka, and Tadashi Arai, a limnologist there. And they went through old diaries and translated them into, you can see here, Excel spreadsheets. And that's where I came in many years after this discovery of this amazing data set. And so there's lots of things that we can learn from this data. And I'm just going to show you something simple. Actually, I wanted to tell you a little story first about Mr. Miyasaka. So he's the chief priest, and he's been recording the dates of the Amawatari. But recently, as you're going to find out soon, the lake isn't freezing as often, but he still goes every day to the lake until February 5th to check if the lake has frozen or not, and if the Amawatari has appeared. And over the coming years, over the past years, we've been communicating and sending him some of our papers and our research findings on SUA. And he's actually started recording, making his own observations. So he's actually recording air temperatures and water temperatures. And in our last Zoom call, it was very sweet because he wanted to show us his Excel graphs. So he's learning how to use Excel with the help of his son, and they're making graphs and learning about correlations and connecting air temperatures to ice. So it's like a really beautiful way of merging religion and tradition with science. And so there's many different things we can learn from this ice record. And I'm going to start with something as simple as years without ice. So these are the number of years without ice in a 50-year period. And I've divided up this time series into 50 years since the record started occurring consistently in 1443 to the present and into the future. And what you can see in the first 250 years of the ice record, Lake Seward did not freeze 3 times. And those 3 times actually coincided with the failure of the rice crop and widespread famine in the region. In the next 50 years, we're starting to see indications of increased ice-free years. And in these cases, what we have actually linked this to is the start of the third industrial revolution in Japan. And there started to be widespread deforestation, increases in human population, and those all are coinciding with increases in ice-free years. In the last 50-year period, Lake Seward isn't freezing, did not freeze 1 out of every 5 years. Since 1988, the lake does not freeze 8 out of every 10 years. So something that was so consistent just a few hundred years ago is on the brink of disappearance. And something that we do is project into the future with climate change scenarios. And here we used every single climate change scenario that was available at the time, and we projected into the future to see if there were which scenarios would expect Lake Seward to freeze. And there wasn't a single scenario that expected Lake Seward to freeze again after 2040s. And so we're in the midst of a disappearing signal. And Lake Seward actually isn't the only lake that's experiencing these ice-free years in recent decades. There's actually a lot more lakes around the world that are doing so. So we were looking at lakes, ice records going back to 1970, just whether or not a lake freezes or not in a particular year. And here we're looking at approximately 1.1 million lakes around the world. And we worked with a graphic designer, graphic artist at the New York Times, and she created this nice animation for us. And what you can see in orange these are the lakes that used to freeze every winter, but are no longer reliably freezing. And what you can see is with warming, as air temperatures warm, you have more and more lakes experiencing these ice-free conditions. And so the warming targets we used here were associated with the IPCC warming scenarios. And you can see that up to 215,000 lakes may no longer reliably freeze every winter. We then took it to the most extreme scenario, permanent ice loss within this century. And here are the number of lakes and the distribution of lakes that are expected to become permanently loss of ice by the end of this century under high greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And we have about 5,700 lakes in this scenario. And you can see a lot of them are actually in like the southern regions where air temperatures are hovering around 0 degrees Celsius, and coastal regions in North America as well as Europe. And so for me, this community lake ice collaboration, where we have hundreds of community scientists tracking the ice dates in their lakes, is especially important because those are the ones that we're forecasting may change in the near future. What if we moderate our greenhouse gas emissions? You see very different scenarios. So even small decreases in greenhouse gas emission scenarios has really beneficial impacts on our lakes and ice cover in this case. And what you can see is that there are only 429 lakes that are expected to become permanently ice-free, even with small reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. There's some lakes, for example, in deep lakes in Switzerland and Germany, they're already have transitioned to ice-free status in the last 100 years. So those we don't expect to return, but mitigating greenhouse gas emissions can have a big impact. And so who are these lakes that are most at risk of losing ice? So as I mentioned, they're lakes found in that region, in southern and coastal regions where air temperatures are hovering around 0 degrees Celsius, the freezing mark, but also deep lakes, even in colder regions. Deep lakes are more likely to lose ice cover. So for example, Lake Constance and other deep lakes in Switzerland and Germany are already experiencing ice-free status. Other lakes that you may recognize, for example, Lake Superior and Lake Michigan, the bays and harbors that we've been actually, community scientists have been sharing their data since 1857 for those lakes. Those may permanently become ice-free by 2060 or 2080. And lack of ice cover has huge ecological implications because you can think of ice, for example, as a lid on a lake surface in the winter. And if you lift that lid early, you may see increased evaporation rates and less freshwater availability. At the same time, earlier ice breakup is also associated with more algal production and even the formation of toxic algal blooms in the summer. And so that can impact our water quality. And if the Great Lakes region, I think, um, provides drinking water to about 30 million people in its watershed. So the lack of ice may have pretty dramatic implications for water resources. What about lakes that still freeze? So most of the millions of lakes actually still freeze every winter, but ice is being lost at rapid rates. These are graphs. These are graphs of some of our longest time series. So here we were interested in time series that went from 100 to 200 or greater than 100 years long. And what we did was there was a great paper published in 2000 by John Magnuson in Science where they recorded for the first time trends in ice loss in lakes and rivers across the Northern Hemisphere. And when he retired, he actually passed on the ice phenology data set to me. So I actually update ice records for thousands of lakes every every year to every few years. And here we updated it to 2020. We published this in 2021, so to 2020. And when we just plotted the data, you could see, so John's data stopped in 1995. We added another 25 years. And just looking at the graphs, we found this really steep decline after 1995. So we did some calculations. So first we looked at over the entire time series, how much shorter is ice? And it's about 18 days per century. Lake Superior actually lost ice at the fastest rate, and it lost, since its data record started in 1857, it lost 60 days of ice cover. So 2 months of less ice cover in some of these bays of Lake Superior since the 1850s. If we looked at, so then we did an analysis in 25-year chunks. And we found that the rates of warming were 6 times faster in the past 25 years than any other time period, and particularly at the time of ice on. And our trends in ice loss were really astounding, like 108 days per century. We calculated it so many different times with different people just to make sure that we had it right, because we really noticed this acceleration in ice loss in the last quarter century. So why? Why is ice melting earlier and freezing later? There's actually, we've done a lot of work on this. Many other people, as I showed you at the beginning, have been looking at answering this question as well. What we try to do is attribute how much of the explanation can be attributed to these factors. And of all of these factors, climate change is the most important. So increases in air temperature because of increases in CO2 records are directly leading to less ice cover. And we're observing this for lakes around the world and over a long time series. The second factor seems to be local weather conditions. So, for example, temperature, precipitation, snow cover, wind, that really has an impact. For example, at within like the week scale, uh, uh, when your lake will freeze or your ice will melt. And then there are these large scale climate drivers. And this is another great reason. Another reason why I love working on ice is because we can really detect these long-term signals that you, it's really rare to have actually direct human observations be able to observe these cycles in the natural world. So what we find is we find a relationship with the El Nino Southern Oscillation and North Atlantic Oscillation. So, for example, this year is a La Nina year, and there seems to be a moderate La Nina setup. And what we're experiencing in the Great Lakes region is a colder, snowier winter. And so, despite the overwhelming driver of climate change, we also have these drivers like the ENSO and the North Atlantic Oscillation, and even solar sunspots that impact our lakes. And we did some complex statistical analysis that I'm not going to share those analysis with you, but I will share the findings. For example, when the Shinto priests started their ice records, the El Nino cycle was about 50 to 90 years long. But because of climate warming and the warming of our oceans and the warming of our planet, it's actually now at about the 3 to 7 year cycle range. And the same is true for the North Atlantic Oscillation. So those are actually contributing to more extreme events in recent years, including these ice-free events that I talked about earlier. In the future, a current PhD student of mine, Aman Bazu, who's amazing quantitatively, he's been forecasting how ice may change around the world, depending upon the degree of warming. And ice, on average, around the world may lose 10 to 28 days of ice cover by the end of the century. The other thing that's changing is ice quality. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot more in recent years. And it started with this great project through an organization called GLEON, the Global Lakes Ecological Observatory Network. And Gesa Wainmeyer from Sweden, Uppsala in Sweden, she actually brought together researchers from around the world in 2020 during the pandemic and asked us all to go to our local lakes and measure ice quality. And so that's the ratio of this black ice, this clear ice to white ice. And she was interested in how ice quality varied around the world. And here's my son who was out helping with these ice quality measurements. And what we found, we were measuring Lake Wilcox in the suburbs of Toronto. And what we found was that in February, those cores were 100% white ice cores. At the same time in Sweden, that was also the case. The Swedish lakes also had 100% white ice cores. And in Sweden, in that same winter, 10 people drowned through those lakes because even though the ice was thick enough for human use, and I'm going to talk about this a lot more in a few minutes, you need about 10 centimeters or 4 inches of black ice for it to be used for humans to skate on the ice and have sufficient load-bearing capacity. And but when the ice core is entirely composed of white ice, it has about half the load-bearing strength. And so people were fatally falling through the ice, unfortunately. So climate change is actually coincides with this increased white ice growth. So for black ice to grow, you need very cold, still temperatures. Um, and so that the lake has sufficient, the water in the lake has sufficient time to freeze. But when temperatures start hovering and kind of oscillating, going up and down to 0 degrees Celsius, you have some melting of your black ice on top, or if it snows and the snow melts and it later refreezes, that starts to compose of white ice. If you have rain in the winter onto your lake surface, that also increases the likelihood of white ice growth. And as I mentioned, it has implications for ice safety because white ice is less strong than black ice, but it also has implications for ecosystem and under ice activity because increased white ice and snow actually decreases the amount of light that's transmitted through the lake surface that affects the whole food web. And so that's something that the postdocs in my lab have been really interested in studying, is aiming to understand ice quality and under ice ecology across lakes and winters. And so I just wanted to show some pictures. So these lakes are about 100 kilometers away from each other. Kempenfelt Bay and Lake Simcoe. Lake Simcoe is a deep lake around a big city. And then Paint Lake is actually where the Dorset Environmental Research Center is. And it's a rural lake in a forested landscape, and it's much smaller. And so you can see very different ice quality conditions in the two lakes experiencing pretty similar climates on the same day, but changes in the landscape and the size of the lake really affect ice growth and the type of ice that's grown. And so, what we're trying to understand is how different winters influence under ice ecology. And so far, what we've seen is we actually studied a warm winter, 2024, um, and a cold, snowy winter in 2025. And what we found in the warmer, less snowy winter was that there's actually more light that's penetrating through the lake surface. You have colder under ice water temperatures, more oxygen, more algal production near the ice surface. So you actually have a more active under ice ecosystem when there's less snow and warmer conditions and less ice cover. The interesting thing we found was in a small lake, so Paint Lake, it's you can see that most of the lake is unsalted, but there's the East Basin is actually has a salted highway that goes through that goes by it. And the first year when we sampled this lake, we were kind of surprised because the water temperatures at the bottom of the lake were 6 degrees Celsius. And if you think about water at maximum density, which Neil might talk about today, the bottom water temperature should be below 4 degrees Celsius, yet it was warming. And then we also noticed that the oxygen levels at the bottom were less than 1 milligram per liter. And so we're quite perplexed by it. And then we started taking we were taking measurements of the water and looking at something called conductivity to look at the ions. And it turns out there were two major ions contributing to these very warm, low oxygen conditions, and they were sodium and chloride. And so what we found was that even low road salt inputs has dramatic implications for the water chemistry under the ice. And in this past winter, where it was colder and presumably more road salt was being applied, the lake didn't mix through the spring and the summer. And this is a lake, the East Basin of this lake didn't mix, which has typically happened. And I think I'm gonna try to stop in 3 minutes because I wanted to show you a video. But climate change not only affects ice loss, it affects, and what we've been studying is how it affects water temperatures. Water temperatures are warmer, and when air temperatures are warmer, we see higher evaporation rates, declining oxygen conditions. There have been great recent studies by researchers who've shown, like Stephen Jane and Joachim Hansen, who've shown that oxygen levels are declining in lakes around the world. Water quality is deteriorating. We're seeing more algal production, perhaps an increase in the proliferation of blooms, algal blooms, because of warmer winters and warmer summers, and increased storm events because of climate change. And also, in the past, I used to work a lot on fisheries, and we've seen this really direct relationship between climate change and decreases in habitat for cool water and cold water fishes like walleye and lake trout, and increases of invasive fishes like smallmouth bass. Before I ended, I really wanted to talk about some public health and cultural implications. And this has really kind of been driving a lot of my recent work. And that is that ice is never 100% safe, and there are guidelines on when ice is safe to use. And I told you a few minutes ago about in Sweden, when the ice core was made up of white ice, 10 people drowned. And at the same time, when we were on these calls, we were people from all different parts of the world. There's somebody who drowned in Lake Simcoe, in other countries as well. So what we did was we decided to put together a long-term data set of winter drownings through lakes. And I called life-saving societies, police stations, coroners' offices around the world. And we actually, one of the hardest things to do, because I'm not a public health researcher, was identify what the code is. If you fall through the ice and have a fatality, there's actually a death code that you get. And we first had all of the death records for the US, and I had a data scientist working with me. And the poor guy had to go through all of the death records in the US to figure out this ice death code. And he had all these nightmares of all the different ways he could die. But we then were able to figure out, okay, this is the code. And so we could translate it around the world. And what we found was actually pretty surprising. So here, what I've graphed out is the number of winter drownings and the winter air temperatures on the x-axis. And so when I think of a drowning, I think of a tragedy that's happened to a person. And what we found was that actually 50% of the variation could be explained by winter air temperatures. So as winter air temperatures increased, there was a higher risk and a higher propensity of fatal winter drownings. There were a few exceptions. So for example, Italy and Germany, they had very low winter drownings in Japan because they have very strong laws and regulations about when you can go out onto the ice. And the police dictate when the ice is safe to use, and people follow the rules. The other place that was an anomaly was northern Canada, so the territories. And we found the highest drownings per capita in the Northern Territories, despite very cold air temperatures. And many of these communities are Indigenous Inuit communities who rely on ice for their livelihood, for travel, for subsistence, and they're associated with increases in search and rescue events, but also fatalities. And we made this graph really colorful because it's actually very sad. So in some cases, we were able to identify what the people were doing when they drowned and how old they were. And kids under 9 were the most frequent drowners, just playing on the ice. If we look at those on snowmobiles, young males, especially in the 20 to 24-year category, were at high risk of drowning. They might be snowmobiling, making bad choices, going out at night under the influence, and that resulted in fatalities, unfortunately. And so we've been trying to understand what that means for safe ice around the world. And so these plots here, they actually summarize 14 billion data points for every grid cell in the world going back to 1850 to 2100. And in here, the 3 degrees Celsius warming. So 1.5, if you see that, that's kind of like where we're at right now. This is with an additional 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. The latitude range from that many of you might be at, actually, 40 to 45 degrees Celsius latitude in North America and Eurasia. Even if the lakes still freeze, they probably will not be safe enough for human use. And what we're doing now is looking at how that was assuming black ice conditions. If we assume white ice conditions, or project white ice conditions, what we find is that even very small declines in ice thickness could render hazardous ice conditions for almost 700 million people. For example, it only takes 1 centimeter decline in black and white ice thickness for load-bearing capacity to be reduced by 460 kilograms. That has huge implications for our infrastructure, our transportation infrastructure, and so, okay, I'll go through this, and I just wanted to show why. So if you have, so 10 centimeters is what the ice thickness is required for safe use. If it's 100% black ice, the allowable load of that ice is about 1,200 kilograms. If that ice core is composed of white ice, it's only 120 kilograms. And so you can see why there have been so many drownings in cases where white ice has replaced the black ice core. One of my students created this film. Jordan, do I have enough time to show this film? It's 3 minutes.
Yes, go for it.
Okay, so Iris was actually a first-year film student. Oops. So 1 second. Ice on dates are becoming like 1 second. And so Iris is a first-year film student who worked with me in the lab and is really, really passionate about the environment. And they created a short documentary about our work on Lake Simcoe. And I just wanted to share it today. It's like the first screening. I think they shared it at the UN Youth Council as well. But first public screening in Ontario. And it's kind of summarizing our work on ice. So I'll just share it now. Ice on dates are becoming later. Ice off dates are becoming earlier, and we're seeing the shorter duration of ice cover. In the last 25 years, ice loss is actually 6 times faster. So declining ice thickness and also changing ice quality.
Some of the major drivers of changing ice quality are temperature primarily, and subsequently snow precipitation variation. So temperature basically just controls how much ice can form overall. And then snow is primarily what governs the white ice formation process. That snow forms on that initial layer of black ice, and then through subsequent freezing and melting or flooding of that pore space, that creates more and more white ice.
For humans, less ice has a variety of consequences. With warmer temperatures, with increased freeze-thaw events, with just changes in our climate, we're seeing more of these white ice conditions. and it's half as strong. And what we found was that more people drowned in warmer winters. And there was this really tight relationship between warmer winter air temperatures and the number of fatal drownings. Particularly alarming because ice is so important for hunting, for snowmobiling, for ice fishing.
Every year we come up for the Berry Winterfest. Hope that there's some ice so we can get out here and fly some of the bigger kites. There's been a couple of years I was out and it made me nervous when people came to stand next to me. Well, I knew it was enough for me. I wasn't so sure about other people.
Ice is becoming less safe.
In the winter months to get access to food, fuel, medicine, and also community networks. Winter ice roads are really important culturally because they connect often remote regions.
The thickness of the ice is changing right now. It's very scary for a lot of our people to transport the young, transport our harvests, and in that same stance, we have to learn how to navigate in different paths, and that means also gambling with different areas.
Understanding ice ecology is crucial to adapting to its changes.
What we're doing is we're able to see the evolution of the ice column through time, and then we're taking other limnological variables such as temperature and oxygen and phytoplankton and light. One of the main impacts that ice quality has on under ice ecosystems is the availability of light. So if you have a white ice layer and snow or a black ice layer and snow, you're getting almost no light coming through the ice surface. Whereas if you were to just have black ice, you can get plenty of light for things like photosynthesis to occur.
As ice degrades in quality and thickness and stays frozen for shorter periods, organisms, people, and ecosystems must adapt. Uncertainty can melt into curiosity and resilience.
Kind of anticipating, seeing what's going to happen has been really interesting.
And that's it for me. So thanks again. So we're actually doing quite a lot of projects in the Arctic right now, working with Indigenous communities and thinking about ice safety and what that means for recreation and food access and transportation and safety overall. But thanks for listening. Happy to take any questions at the end, and I will pass it over to Neil to talk about the open water season.
Thank you very much, Sapna. Very in-depth study, and I'm amazed at how long some of those historical records are and how the culture has so much influenced people's taking the observations which we come back to as scientists. I found that quite interesting. I'll just get my screen sharing going here. Okay. So we are going to be, again, talking about the things that we can't see, but the physical properties that end up influencing so much of the things that we like about lakes and the things that we like about what live in lakes. I really want to talk about a few things, the physical properties of water, which are really responsible for the behavior of the water column in a lake, which ultimately determines the habitat that's available for different organisms that live in the lake. It determines partially the chemistry of what can make that lake productive or not, and ultimately the ecology of our temperate lakes. All of these, the ecology has evolved to take advantage of the physical properties of lakes. Key points are the seasonal changes in temperature determine water density. Water density, it changes with temperature, and this structures habitat and it structures oxygen dynamics in the lake. We'll be talking about that in detail. One thing we won't be talking about, but which I'd like to mention, is the heat capacity of water, which buffers lakes from rapid changes in air temperature and provides a much more stable thermal environment. We could appreciate this when the sun goes down in July and it drops to 15 degrees from 30 degrees. The lake still stays at its warm summer temperature because it takes a long time to lose that heat from the lake. We can also see the enormous importance of heat capacity when we look at climate change and the oceans, which store so much heat, but now give it off more slowly in large amounts and create hurricanes. So the heat capacity of water ends up providing a very stable environment on a day-to-day basis, although we still get the annual fluctuations. The nature of ice allows aquatic life to survive our cold winters, and we're going to be talking about that, how important ice is. Of course, we've just heard lots of wonderful anecdotes and science about ice, but we'll do a few more details there. I'd like to talk about two key relationships which structure most of what's going on here. One, is Dr. Sharma has said, is that water is at its greatest density at 4 degrees. So as the temperature declines, the water gets denser and denser until at 4 degrees the molecular structure changes and the water gets lighter again and less dense. And you might not think, as we're scientists, we always like to run a line through the zero origin, but that's not how the water density works. Once you hit 0 degrees and the ice freezes, something else remarkable happens, is that the water molecule expands. And expanded molecules take up less space in a volume, and so we get ice formation that floats. And the density of ice is approximately 8% less than water. This has some very important implications for ice formation. And if ice was at its densest at 0 degrees when it first formed, we'd probably find that it would be floating down to the bottom of the lake, and we'd be continually making ice at the top until a shallow lake was filled up with ice, leaving no water for aquatic habitat. So the fact that ice floats shields the lake and prevents the whole lake from freezing, as well as we've heard earlier, becomes a very effective buffer, protection, a cap for wind blowing. The other temperature-dependent phenomenon is the solubility of dissolved oxygen. As temperature drops, water can hold more oxygen. That's also quite important, we'll see, in structuring the habitat requirements of freshwater life. So let's step outside on the Muskoka Bay, and we'll start there, take a look around Muskoka Bay outside of our Discovery Center, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. And here we are out on the ice this was in 2003, and we are about to take a little profile to see what's going on underneath Muskoka Bay. I will use the terms Gravenhurst Bay and Muskoka Bay interchangeably. It's just a local thing. We all know what we mean. But here we were in about 15 meters of water, and as expected, the less dense water at between less than 4 degrees was at the surface. And as we went down and the water got warmer, we saw a warming profile with depth. And again, this just shows the profile of the colder water. The water closer to 4 degrees is at the bottom, and the lighter water is up at the top. And then we'll see that the ice, that layer that forms at 0 degrees, and when the density drops by 8%, the ice floats, and this insulating layer prevents further ice formation into the deeper water, as we've also explained. It also insulates from wind-driven mixing over the winter. So that's also could be seen as a bad thing, because the dissolved oxygen content that's in that water, when it freezes, when the surface freezes, is going to have to last the aquatic life all winter. So there's factors consuming that oxygen, decomposition of algal production, fish respiration, etc. So all that oxygen that's there when the ice forms, there will no longer be any mixing with the atmosphere, so that the oxygen volume mass has to last until springtime. Which, when springtime comes, the ice melts. As the ice melts and the cold water of 0 degrees warms up to 4 degrees, it sinks. You get passive sinking of water from the surface as it warms up down to the bottom, displacing the colder water. And then, at this point, wind has a very significant effect and will be circulating the whole water column from the top to the bottom. And this wind energy is substantial. You have that plus the passive density-dependent sinking of water, which is going to restore dissolved oxygen levels after the winter minima volumes. So again, we've got this opportunity to replace the oxygen, and we'll see that this stratification is going to develop, and that this oxygen in turn has to get the lake through till the fall. And we'll explain how that happens. So onset of stratification, I've now switched from a profile that we made to one that was done by the District of Muskoka in May of 2023. It's a good point here to put a kudo out to the District Municipality of Muskoka, who have been monitoring water quality for 30, 40 years. They have an excellent record of water quality in over 200 lakes, and we're the first municipality in the country to put water quality into their official plan. So we're very grateful they recognize the importance of our lakes here. But they were out here in May 23, and we have the temperature profile. We're starting to see now that the water at the surface is warming up, and it's getting lighter and lighter, and so we're getting warm water at the top. And the sunlight only penetrates to a certain depth, about 7 meters or so, in Gravenhurst Bay, but it warms up the upper layer, and then the temperature drops off back down to what we saw there in the wintertime and the springtime when the lake was mixing, and we have temperatures of less than 8 degrees down at the bottom. We have an area of about 3 or 4 meters where the temperature declines quite quickly with depth. We have the light water sitting on top of the heavier water, and this is called a thermocline, this area where the temperature changes by more than a degree for every meter. And the volume of water delineated between the thermocline and the hypolimnion is called the metalimnion. So this is the setup. As we see, the sunlight is penetrating there. The wind, once we get this set up here, the wind can no longer mix the bottom. We have a density layer there that isolates the epilimnion from the hypolimnion. And so the wind mixing only stirs up the upper waters and maintains a good dissolved oxygen concentration. So this density-dependent stratification is isolating the bottom waters here and allowing this temperature to set up. And we'll see that it's still early in the season. We have lots of dissolved oxygen. We're pretty much near saturation up in the epilimnion because we're in constant contact with the atmosphere. And then we drop down, and even though the water's getting colder, we're losing a bit of oxygen with depth, largely because of decomposition processes happening in the bottom waters. So the summer continues to get warm. We're going swimming in the lakes. The temperature is rising up to 22 degrees. The sun is still shining down to about 7 meters. The wind is still mixing the epilimnion, but the temperature at the surface has been rising. The temperature at the top of the thermocline is still rising, but it's still about 8 degrees down at the bottom of the thermocline and into the hypolimnion. So we've got a very effective density-dependent temperature stratification going on in the lake, isolating the warm upper layers from the cold bottom layers. And again, the depth of the warming is really determined by the depth of sun penetration, which is a factor of water color, and wind mixing. The longer the fetch, the longer the distance the wind can blow over the lake, the more it will mix. You can sometimes get very strong winds in the summertime, which would break down this thermocline, but it would quickly reset itself after the wind dropped. But we see now that we have a cold hypolimnion and temperature would be dropping there. So just a reminder of the temperature-dependent solubility, and cold water holds more oxygen, and that there are two zones, two oxygen dynamics happening. Down in the cold bottom waters in the hypolimnion, we have an oxygen demand. We're having respiration by fish and decomposition by bacteria of all of the aquatic primary production. The algae that grows at the surface ultimately dies and sinks down to the bottom, and the oxygen is consumed by bacteria, which are mineralizing those nutrients, making them available again, and powering another part of the system. As opposed to the upper layers of the water, the sunlit part of the water, where photosynthesis by algae is actually producing oxygen. The algae respire at night, but that oxygen is maintained by the wind, but they photosynthesize during the day, and photosynthesis actually provides oxygen into the water. So these factors start influencing the temperature and oxygen stratification that you'd see in the water. So again, here is the full stratification. We've got the euphotic zone here. We call that the euphotic zone. You see it extends down below the epilimnion. It goes down to about 7 meters, and that's just the depth of sun penetration of 1% level of light in the zone. And below that, the algae sink from the euphotic zone down into the lower layers of the water where bacteria decompose them. And so that's the process going on: primary production, producing oxygen, and then decomposition, consuming oxygen. And even though it's colder down here now, we're still seeing a loss of oxygen. So we are seeing then that really in this case, in Gravenhurst Bay, the profile of dissolved oxygen is following the temperature profile pretty closely, except for one little odd exception right here. And we're going to talk about that. The algae, of course, as we said, are photosynthesizing, producing oxygen here and sinking. But of course, the thermocline, the temperature is dropping, the density is increasing, and so the algae are still, they come and they are settling out on top of this denser water, and then they are being decomposed by bacteria, and oxygen is being lost in these waters. So even though the temperature is getting cooler, the metabolism of the lake and the bacterial decomposition is removing oxygen from the water. And at some point becomes balanced again, temperature takes over, but then we still see ultimately the algae drop down to the bottom and consume oxygen. And we know that on occasion, Gravenhurst Bay will actually lose all of its oxygen by the end of the summer. So what happens as the summer ends and the lake cools? Well, the surface water cools and continues to mix. The temperature profile drops down from 22 degrees. We still maintain a thermocline at about the same depth. The hypolimnion still remains stratified and cool, but oxygen continues to decline. Again, these bottom waters have not seen the atmosphere since May, since the lake was mixing over, so that locked-in mass of oxygen is now down to pretty much close to zero here because we have a productive system and algae running down into the lake. Then the famous gales of November arrive in November when the lake is cooled to about 4 degrees again. We're down to 4 degrees. We've reached our maximum density, so you get passive sinking of the cold water, and again, strong winds in November, especially strong winds, will get the whole lake mixing from top to bottom again, and this will restore the dissolved oxygen levels that have been depleted over the course of the summer by the production raining down into it. And of course, this all repeats itself in 5 months. The lake continues to cool. We get ice formation again at the top, and we get the cold water density dependent profile mimicking the density response. And then this all repeats in 5 months when it warms up again. We're locked in for the winter. But let's add a confounding factor. We saw Dr. Sharma talk about salinity in Paint Lake and how the salinity had actually prevented mixing in that lake. We thought we would go out and look at conductivity as a surrogate for road salt in Gravenhurst Bay, knowing that salinity also increases density of the water. The higher the salinity, the greater the density of water. So because of that, salty water will sink into the lake. We know from 50 years of data from the Ministry of the Environment and the District of Muskoka that the chloride content, the salt content in Muskoka Bay has been increasing from less than 1 part per million in 1970 to around 16 or 17 currently, so a 35-fold increase. And this is all a response to urban runoff from the roads and the parking lots and the driveways and the sidewalks that drain into Muskoka Bay. When the water drains in, we're using salt in the winter, so we get salty, cold water. 2 factors that increase the density of the water. And so we end up with a layer of high salinity and high density at the bottom of Gravenhurst Bay. It's about 75 or so up at the top, and it's about 4 times higher down at the bottom, increasing with depth. Again, as the conductivity increases. And again, we're not looking at temperature anymore. We're looking at conductivity, which is a surrogate for road salt, for the chloride ion in road salt. So we've seen this happening in Gravenhurst Bay. And we've heard that prevents mixing in Paint Lake. And we've also been shown that even if it doesn't prevent it, it may delay it. Now, this again worked by, we've heard about Dr. Magnuson. This is the lab in Wisconsin, one of the lakes that they're looking at. It's a bit of complex graph, but let's just have a look here. These two lines are temperature. This is the bottom temperature, and this is the upper temperature. And we'll see that the temperature in the bottom and the surface are a couple of degrees apart over the course of the winter. This is the ice-on period, the dotted lines. Normally, we get to the point where both the surface water and the bottom water are the same temperature, when even if they're not 4 degrees, they're the same temperature, so there's very little barrier to their mixing. So the wind would mix that lake, and you would see the lake turn over and destratify. We look at the red line. The red line is the difference in salt content in conductivity between the surface and the bottom. So this is showing a high difference, meaning there's a lot of saline water at the bottom. And so when the temperatures matched, the temperature-dependent density was not sufficient to overcome the salt-dependent density, until quite some time later when the temperature rose enough and we finally got the whole lake mixing from top to bottom, and the salinity dropped and leveled out as the whole water column mixed, and the surface water and the bottom water continued to rise. So here we see a delay in the spring overturn. So not only do we have the ice layer coming off, as we've heard, we have the spring overturn happening later. So there's a very complex play of the dynamics of the lake going on here, and something to be quite wary of. So oxygen dynamics change with lake productivity, giving us two kinds of oxygen temperature curves. We're talking in Muskoka, we have oligotrophic lakes. Oligo is few, trophic is nutrient status. So our lakes have low primary productivity. So what this means is there's less production up on the surface waters and a lower oxygen demand of less material raining down to the bottom to be decomposed, and higher hyperlimnetic oxygen. So these lakes have what we call an orthograde oxygen curve, where we have the temperature, as we've seen already, higher at the surface going down through a thermocline down to lower at the bottom, and oxygen being fairly low at the surface, but because the temperature is decreasing and there's very little production, the oxygen is increasing as you get down to the bottom. And this is what we call orthograde. What we saw in Gravenhurst Bay, however, was quite different. We saw the temperature profile doing just what it did before. It's the same temperature profile. These are idealized. These are not measured, but they are idealized. And the oxygen, because there's so much production, the temperature-dependent solubility is not sufficient to offset the decomposition of oxygen. So you end up losing oxygen down below the thermocline until you hit the anoxic area, where there's less than half a part per million or no oxygen whatsoever. So these are in the more productive lakes, you get higher primary productivity. Decomposition is increasing the oxygen demand, and the oxygen demand is exceeding the temperature dependency. Once you lose the oxygen, another chemical dynamic comes into play, and phosphorus, which is our limiting nutrient in our lakes, determines how much algae is going to be there, is often limited in short supply. But once you lose the oxygen, the iron, the complex of phosphorus, which has been locked up in the sediments, changes. And with oxygen, phosphorus is locked into the sediments and not available. Once you lose the oxygen, the chemistry changes, and the phosphorus comes back into the water column. So you end up getting a positive feedback between high nutrients coming in from the top and high nutrients coming in from the bottom. So the lake dynamics have a lot to do with the with oxygen status as well. One other thing that we'd want to talk about is basin morphometry and how it determines temperature and oxygen status. Again, here's Gravenhurst Bay. We have about 14 meters deep where we measured, and we had, as you'll recall, about 7 meters of productive zone. So you got 7 meters, the upper 7 meters of the water column are producing algae and production, and the bottom 7 meters are there to decompose that. So there's the mass of oxygen available is not a huge amount, because we have a fairly shallow hypolimnion, and of course a lake is cone-shaped. So the deeper you go, the less volume there is. If we go out into the middle of Lake Muskoka, which is pretty much the same trophic status, we're 50 meters deep. We still have production and temperature up in the epilimnion at 7 meters, but now we have 43 meters of volume of water available to assimilate that oxygen demand. So the shape of the basin is very important here in maintaining the oxygen status, and as you can see, the oxygen does not drop off in the middle of Lake Muskoka, out in the bay there. So again, basin morphometry is very important in determining oxygen dynamics. Our rough rule of thumb at Dorset was if a lake was 20 meters or less deep, you could almost certainly guarantee that it would go anoxic over the course of the summer. Whereas if it was over 20, if it was over 25, you could almost certainly guarantee that there'd be enough oxygen to get by. So again, we now have temperature, solubility, dependency, we have morphometry and nutrient status that can determine the oxygen requirements in a lake, the oxygen status. Well, what's this got to do with the big things that we can see? We know that we have iconic cold water species in Lake Muskoka, all throughout Muskoka, such as the lake trout and the lake whitefish, which are known to be cold water species. They thrive in cold water. The optimal habitat for lake trout is water less than 12 degrees. They'll live above 12 degrees, but the best habitat and growth and survival is where water is cooler than 12 degrees and where oxygen status is more than 6 or 7 milligrams per liter. This is the optimal habitat for fish like lake trout and lake whitefish. We also have smallmouth bass and pike in Muskoka Bay and Lake Muskoka. They like cold waters too, but they're able to tolerate warmer waters and to tolerate lower dissolved oxygen. So this gives them different habitats that they can exploit. So we then look at our two areas in Lake Muskoka again. We can see different habitat segregation. Dissolved oxygen is in red here. So in Muskoka Bay, we have 6 milligrams per liter of oxygen or more at 5 meters and above, based on our oxygen line. So only in the upper 5 meters would there be enough oxygen for lake trout to thrive. The problem is that the water is below 12 degrees at 8 meters down. So the cool optimal habitat water for temperature is isolated and separated from the optimal oxygen area. So there's no what we call optimal habitat for lake trout and cold water fish here. Smallmouth bass and pike are quite able to deal with the both of it. They can tolerate the lower oxygen, they can tolerate higher temperatures and thrive at them. If we go offshore into the main basin where it's 50 meters deep, here we'll see a much different situation where we have the dissolved oxygen exceeds 6 parts per million at 30 meters and above, and the temperature is less than 12 degrees from about 10 meters down to the bottom. So we have cold water throughout that lake, less than 12 degrees, and we have oxygenated status in the upper 20 meters of cold water habitat. So this means there's lots of good habitat for lake trout and lake whitefish in the offshore basins, in the main basin of Lake Muskoka, and of course the smallmouth bass would like it out there as well. So that's kind of, we've gone from the physical dynamics to how they influence the habitat and what kind of fish we might expect to see as a result. So just to summarize what we've talked about, we know that temperature, density, and wind are responsible for the behavior, the habitat, and ultimately the ecology of our temperate lakes. The nature of ice, which floats, allows aquatic life to survive our cold winters. Spring and fall turnover are critical processes to maintain oxygenated water in the hypolimnion and oxygen dynamics. Climate change, we've already seen, is altering the thermodynamics of lakes, and we've heard about that from Dr. Sharma, and I suspect Dr. Patterson will be talking about that in a couple of weeks. Loss of oxygen impairs habitat for aquatic life and changes the chemical reactions between water and sediments. And salinity from road runoff increases the density of deep lake water and impairs spring overturn mixing. Now, you can certainly consult any of us at Friends of Muskoka Watershed. We'd love to come and we could talk for an hour on road salt as well. But we just thought we brought it up tonight as one of the stresses and how it fits into the density behavior of our lakes. So that's all that I have to say, and I thank you very much, and I thank my mentor, Paddle to the Sea, for keeping me reminded of how important our watersheds are. Thank you.
I'm Sandy Lockhart, and I'm going to be answering the questions tonight, or not answering, giving out the questions tonight. I'm with Friends of Muskoka Watershed. We have 6 questions, And I'll start at the beginning. The first one is, are communities starting to reduce road salt use as a result of these findings? And I believe that was from the first speaker.
I think this could be relevant to both of us and even Norman Yan here. So I just want to preface, this is the only road salt study that I've done. There's great researchers in Canada, for example, Shelley Arnott, in the US, Hilary Dugan, who do like amazing work on freshwater salinization. And there are, to my understanding, there are many there's a lot of research going into finding alternatives and different solutions to reducing road salt or using alternative sources of salt. And I'm going to pass it over to Neil. Sounds
Thanks,
like.
Sapna. It's very timely, that question. I don't know how many people were listening to Ontario Morning on CBC this morning, but they had the roads manager, the operations manager for the city of Barrie, who reported that they had dropped their road salt applications in half and had seen no change in safety of the roads, and was quite pleased that actually city of Barrie reduced their salt applications by half. And so there's now 25 municipalities in the province that have pledged to reduce road salt. All of the local municipalities in the district of Muskoka have as well. And of course, we're actively working to get the public to recognize that they don't need as much salt as they think they do to have safety.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil and Sapna. Our next question is for Sapna. Do you use the Ice Watch data or Nature Watch?
So I peruse the Ice Watch data for sure. There's some of the contributors to Ice Watch that we actually work with to get some of the data, but something that is really important to us is knowing what the definition of ice on and ice off is. Because everybody can use different definitions. So in our community lake ice collaboration, we use 100% ice on, 100% ice off as the ice on, ice off definition. Other people use the first boat to leave the harbor and the last boat to leave the harbor. And when you do long-term studies, the important thing is that the definitions don't change. So when we work with ice observers and community scientists, we need to have conversations about the definitions that they're using. Are they consistent through time? Are they standing in the same location where they're looking at the ice? And we actually track all of that. And so on Ice Watch, some of that's missing. Some of that information's missing, so we can't use that data per se. But some of the people we can get in touch with who contribute to Ice Watch, where we can get more of the certainty on definitions and actually be able to detect the climate signal.
Thank you. Also, similar question. Do you ever get data on ice from recreation users like anglers or snowmobilers to widen your reach?
That's like a dream of mine, is to get ice data from anglers. So we actually get like some of the people who send us their data, they're avid anglers or they live on their lake. And so they send us their data. But I'm really interested. So for most of our lakes, we only have one measure of ice thickness. Or actually, there's very little measurements of ice thickness, to be honest. So there's few measurements of ice thickness, but we have ice on, ice off dates. And ice quality, there are even fewer measurements. But anglers have all that information. So like the dream one day is to figure out how can we like work together with those communities, because then we can actually have better measurements of ice quality and of ice thickness. That's really important for ice safety. So yes, that's one day. I have many more decades left to work on ice. So we'll figure that out one day.
Yeah, sounds great. To both Sapna and Neil, how did you become interested in this specific field of study?
Why don't I let Neil go first?
Well, lakes are just generally cool. I think a lot of my interest was exposure to a wonderful lake in Temagami, where my family went as a child, and I always just felt an engagement to the water there. And as a teenager in the 60s, kind of the environmental awareness movement came on for the first time, and I became aware of what we were doing to the environment around us. And over time, that just became interest in water pollution. So my doctorate was in the toxicology of acid rain. But then just through your work experience, that expands and you realize that there's just so much to know about lakes and they're such a wonderful place to work.
I'm a little different, I think. So I was interested in climate change. Even as a kid, I was interested in climate change because of like the repercussions on the planet. And I became interested in water from a different angle. It was thinking about Walkerton was when I was growing up, that was kind of a big issue with water security. And then also why I later on actually developed this Unitar Global Water Academy is I'm really interested in water security and I'm interested in people having access to clean water and it being equitable and knowing how climate change impacts that and how climate change and all these anthropogenic drivers like, pollution and land cover changes on all of those interact to affect our environment. So, um, that's actually where my interest is. It wasn't necessarily about the lakes, but it was more about like climate change and water security. Um,
Well, when I was young, we hadn't really heard of climate change yet, Sapna. So
yeah. Yeah.
Sandy, you're muted.
Because I was making noise. Um, this next one is for Neil, and it's when you talk about the algae dying and falling to the bottom, are you talking about the filamentous algae or the cyanobacteria or both?
both and all. Filamentous algae would be more important in the near shore, but everything that grows ultimately dies and falls to the bottom. Offshore, we'd be talking about phytoplankton, which would include cyanobacteria, but also diatoms and green algae and brown algae. So both inshore and offshore, it's the algae that's suspended in the water that would filter down and sink to the bottom.
Okay. And for Sapna, if a community wants to be able to make better ice safety decisions, what does it cost? Money plus capacity to run a solid ice risk forecast decision system, especially if volunteers can help collect data. Thank you.
That's a good question, and it's a tricky question. So that's something we're trying to create this like ice safety dashboard right now for Arctic communities, and it's challenging. But I think within a local lake system, if you had many different observers, I know of people developing apps to do it, to getting ice conditions. So, for example, in the Arctic, there's something called Siku that records ice conditions by location. And people actually use Facebook a lot to share about ice safety and they also have indigenous communities making maps of safe areas and unsafe areas to travel across. So I think if you have the capacity, being an ecologist, I think all of us who are ecologists, we've like learned to do things fairly cheaply because this is not where the money usually is. So it's possible. So if you could create, work with a local university or even high school students to create an app. If you can have some geolocation with it, have the latitude, longitude signals, and then you could have people input ice data, it might make it actually quite feasible to do it at a local scale.
Okay. Next, how can we best get in touch with someone from Muskoka Watershed? So being from Friends of Muskoka Watershed, are we looking for Muskoka Watershed or Friends of Muskoka Watershed? I guess, Neil, you want to give both answers?
Well, I presume since people are watching this webinar, it's Friends of Muskoka Watershed that would be the interest. I would just Google Friends of Muskoka Watershed, and you can get in touch with us there through email. Sandy, I think you are usually the first person that reads the questions that we get and sends us back out to who can answer that question best. The Muskoka Watershed Council is another group in Muskoka, and they're kind of run as a partnership with the District of Muskoka. So I think, again, their website would be the first place to go.
And with us, it's just easy. Friends at fotmw.org. And that goes to me, and I will just connect you to whoever's the best fit to answer your question. Okay, and thank you, Dr. Sharma. Oh, and Dr. Hutchinson for the presentation. New one, Neil, you emphasize the importance of wind in lake ecology. Can you comment on Dr. Sharma's comment on changes in wind patterns as a result of climate change and their impact on lake health? We noticed that this past summer, there were stronger, steadier winds blowing into Gravenhurst Bay almost daily.
Again, Dr. Sharma, please interject if you need to. One of the patterns I think we've noticed here in Muskoka from the long-term climate records at Dorset is the average wind speed hasn't changed, but we do get long periods with no wind followed by shorter periods of intense wind. So we're getting more variation in that. And I think that's been seen at the Paint Lake Meteorological Station. Other than that, I don't have any direct evidence. But certainly what we're worried about with algal blooms would be a long period of hot, still water, which would tend to favor cyanobacteria because the heavier algae like diatoms would settle out of the water column, whereas the wind would tend to keep them back up in the water column and provide a more balanced community. So I think the wind would influence that. And of course, the magnitude of the wind and the length of wind might influence when a lake sets up and stratifies and at what depth it stratifies to. But I don't have any direct knowledge of that. Sapna, did you have any comment?
Yeah, wind is tricky, especially when you're working at like a global scale. Wind is very tricky. So overall, there seems to be indications that things are getting less windy. So they're talking about stilling. But it's very tricky because it depends on the landscape, it depends on forest, it depends on fetch, and it can change and it's very hard to measure. So I know that wind is very important, so it's important to mixing. It's also important to ice. It's Wind is really important in dictating whether when the ice will form at the beginning of the winter. You need those still days. Wind is also important for ice growth if it's blowing snow off the lake. It's important at the end of winter. So it's very important in many ecological aspects, but it's also very hard to measure. But it's interesting to know that Christine has made these observations recently in Gravenhurst Bay.
Okay, next, what is the ideal timing? Oh, to water sample for phosphorus after spring overturn? Is the end of May too late for shallow lakes?
We try to. The best time is when the lake is turning over. Then you have a uniform gradient of water from top to bottom, and one sample can give you the average really easily. That said, our lakes are not particularly productive and tend to be fairly stable. So really, up and into June, you're usually going to get a fairly accurate measurement of phosphorus in the water. Just when the lake is not stratified for very long. But once it's stratified, things might change a bit more differently. But that would depend on the lake and the watershed. But generally speaking, up until mid-June, you'll probably get in a low productive lake like what we have here, you tend to get a pretty accurate reading.
Thank you. Keith is adding a wrinkle to Sapna's drowning study. A longer ice-free season will mean more lake effect snow, more accidents, more traffic fatalities. So lake ice can affect water fatalities, but it can also affect fatalities on land. A whole new database to consider.
Yeah, so actually we've been working a little bit on winter ice roads. And I've actually, if somebody invites me, like I got invited to talk on the trucker radio station. So I spoke to truckers for about an hour about lake effect snow and traffic fatalities. And that was something they mentioned a lot. Like in the Great Lakes region, because of increased lake effect snow, it's become much more treacherous to drive. And in the past, it used to be at a limited time, like November, for example, or December could be quite tricky to drive in some regions. But because of how the winter patterns are changing, it's actually extending further into the winter season. So that's something we've thought about. It's something we've talked about in a recent paper, but we haven't put together any data on that. But yeah, it definitely has a big impact on driving. And I think we can think about lake effect snow for, you guys in Bracebridge and Gravenhurst, right? Like last year was was just here we had a little bit of snow in Toronto, but up where you had some record-breaking snowfall. So the lake effect snow definitely has a big impact in certain regions.
Okay, thank you. In some of the lakes in the district of Muskoka, the phosphorus levels have been increasing and ranging between 10 UG per liter to 30 UG per liter. Is that what that is? What could be causing the increase and what can be done to decrease the phosphorus levels?
I think what you're reporting is a range in phosphorus levels in Muskoka, which tends to go. The UG is micrograms per liter parts per billion. Our lakes go from 3 up to about 25 or so micrograms per liter. The district's data shows that there is no increasing trend in any of our lakes. And records done by paleolimnologists in the early 90s showed that phosphorus levels in the 90s were about the same as they've been historically. So there is no record of increasing phosphorus. Muskoka Bay has actually decreased substantially in the last 30 years since better sewage treatment and moving the outfall into the main basin of the lake.
I'm just going to add something a little different, not about phosphorus, but about chlorophyll and cyanobacteria. So, for example, we worked with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks out in Thunder Bay, and they've been recording in the last few years the first observations of cyanobacterial blooms in the northern nearshore regions of Lake Superior. We're also seeing extreme conditions and chlorophyll conditions across nearshore regions of the Great Lakes. And that might be attributed to climate warming, where increases in air temperatures and increases in storm events can increase, even if you have decreasing nutrient levels, you can have increased influxes of nutrients into lakes that has consequences on algal production.
Okay. We have a couple people asking, what do you suggest for those who wish to pursue careers in this or similar fields in schooling versus work experience? And thank you for the presentation.
That's a good question, and it's a tricky question. Um, it depends on, if you want to be doing research in these fields, or you want to be a practitioner in the fields. I work with students right now, and it's a quite challenging work environment. It's hard to get a job. For students, there's so many people trying to find jobs, and people are getting training. So, like, I think it's always a good idea to get experience, network, but having an educational background, whether it's college or university, depending on the position you want to have, can be really important in this very competitive work environment.
Those were very good points. I'm, again, being younger, benefited from government programs that used to hire students to go do environmental work. So I worked for a summer for Ministry of Natural Resources and 2 summers for the Ministry of the Environment in Hamilton, working on what was then one of the most polluted water bodies in the country. And I learned a lot from that. Those programs paid minimum wage, but they gave you great experience. After that, you do have to go to school. There's lots to learn. There's no shortage of interesting stuff to learn. The question becomes then, I think, how far you want to go in school. And once you've got a bachelor's or is it worth going on to a master's or worth going on to a doctorate? That depends, as Sapna said, about if you have research interests or not. You're going to likely end up with a doctorate, a master's. Work experience or a good work experience and a good master's might be considered equivalent. Certainly, when I was hiring people as a consultant, I paid less attention to that and whether they could write and think well. So,
This is more of well, it's a question and a comment. Thank you for your very informative presentation. Our American friends are being pulled away from environmental impacts. There's a danger of rain and lake acidity increasing. Are we in danger of a return to dead lakes?
I'm gonna say I'm an optimist. Despite what my presentation might indicate, I am an optimist, and there's so many smart people working on environmental issues, working on novel technologies, working and just creative people, young people really interested in saving the planet. Um, I think like I feel like there's hope. If there is a return to some dead lakes, there will be a lot of research on why and what's going on and what can we do to fix the situation. But I think um, I I'm hopeful for the future.
yeah, I've always challenged the term dead lakes. There's no such thing certainly in Ontario or Canada. We have lakes that have been very much altered by the pollutants that go into them, but dead is really one hard stop at the end. And I would hope that we're wise enough now that we could recognize the trajectory that a water body might be in that might take it to a bad state. That is the reason to keep monitoring and keep looking at what's going on and trying to understand what's going on in the waters. And keep your eye on those politicians and make sure they understand how important it is.
Absolutely. Sapna, how would you suggest someone studying lake biogeochemistry use ice quality data in their analysis? I'm already using ice on, ice off, and ice duration.
That's a great question. So, as I mentioned in one of the answers, we have a lot more ice on, ice off, ice duration data, whether it's collected by community scientists or through satellites or our modeling efforts. So, there's actually lots of information on that. Ice quality data, there's very little. One of my PhD students, Aman Bazu, he actually scoured every piece of literature out there. He actually found 23,000 records of ice quality data, but only from, I think it was like 120 lakes around the world. And we have um, millions and millions of lakes. So there isn't actually very much information on ice quality. Also, I think I would say the patterns aren't clear yet. So I wouldn't worry about it. If you're using an indication of ice, like something I would use instead of something that might be easier to get is snow depth, because if you're looking at biogeochemistry, the ice quality may impact a little bit of the light attenuation. It might affect, part of the processes, but it seems like snow might play a bigger role. Um, this is all really preliminary because we're still studying this at the moment. So if you can't find ice quality data, I think snow depth would be a good a good indicator of light that might be important to your study.
Okay, thank you. Here's a short and sweet one. Can a lake still turn over if there's no ice cover?
Yes.
Okay.
Wind and temperature dependent. Wind and temperature will still be the influencing factors.
Okay, excellent. Which lake strata is best for drinking water, or does it not make any difference?
Probably doesn't make any difference. I think water intakes tend to want to be down deeper, where there's a bit more water to dilute any watershed influences coming in, and where the water is cooler, and people like to drink cooler water.
And here's a comment on one of the answers, the questions about phosphorus. So the District of Muskoka's phosphorus data is selective. There are lakes that have 20 years of data that are showing different data than what you reported. Please share how one can decrease phosphorus.
Well, the government took big strides in the 70s by legislating minimum levels of phosphate in detergents. Every one of our sewage plants in Muskoka are treating and removing phosphorus from our sewage to the very highest level. They are producing excellent results. That leaves really landscape as the big factor. And that becomes a matter of minimizing deforestation, minimizing lawns. Don't fertilize your lawn, especially these lawns that are on the shoreline. You want to maintain a naturalized shoreline because the natural environment wants phosphorus. Terrestrial plants want phosphorus. It's a valuable nutrient, and so a good intact ribbon of trees and vegetation will suck up phosphorus. You cut them all down, you're going to get soil washing into the lake and bringing phosphorus with it.
I think, like, I'll just add, promoting wetlands, saving our wetlands is really important to minimize phosphorus inputs as well. Further south than where in Muskoka, there's plans to develop wetlands, which will have dramatic impacts on water quality. Um, and you know, the timing of fertilizer application can make a big difference as well into decreasing phosphorus loads if you're a farmer and need to fertilize your soil, and the timing can really impact, so it's not flushing into the system and taken up more by your plants.
Okay, we just have two little questions left. One is, how general do you think the paint lake pattern might be in Muskoka? So I guess, like, how does that apply to Muskoka? Is that what they're asking?
Yeah, that's a good question, because so when we were reviewing the road salt literature, and even the presentation that the figure that Neil presented was from Lake Monona. Most of the lakes that had been observed were really they're urban lakes with a lot of salt input. I think small shallow lakes may be more at risk in rural areas than is currently known. So that's something that we're thinking about, is trying to identify, like, what are the characteristics of lakes that are most sensitive to these road salt inputs, and I think there might be more than you would believe, but I don't know how many.
And then the only thing left are several people saying thank you very much for an engaging, helpful, interesting talk. Do either of you have anything else you want to say or add?
If I can just follow up on Sapna's last comment, download the Muskoka Watershed Council's Watershed Report Card from 2 years ago, which has a whole chapter on road salt. And about 1/4 of our lakes are high enough that we might be concerned about aquatic life, and about 70% of our lakes have had their concentrations of chloride raised by road salting activities. So there is information out there.
Okay. I think we're going to wrap it up now then. Thank you everybody for coming. We really appreciate it. Please come back next week, same time. We will have Gord Miller and Dr. Norman Yan speaking. And then again on February 3rd, we have two more speakers. So watch your email. More information will be coming in your email. If you have any questions, you can contact me at sandy@fotmw.org or the email that comes from the steamships. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight.
Good night.
Thanks for all your great questions.
Thanks.